And joining me to discuss this is Roel Hoenders, the head of air pollution and energy efficiency at the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. Roel, thank you for taking the time and being on the show. IMO first initiated action on climate change in 2011 when it first adopted measures to cut GHG emissions from international shipping. What are the targets that were agreed upon for 2030 and 2050, and what were briefly the main initiatives that were put in place thus far?
10 years ago, IMO indeed put in place the first mandatory energy efficiency requirements that covered an entire global transport sector. And 10 years ago, IMO required all new ships that were built in yards worldwide to become increasingly more stringent or energy efficient performance. And these requirements have been strengthened over years. In 2018, IMO agreed on a landmark agreement, which was our initial greenhouse gas strategy, setting out CO2 reduction targets for the global fleet of over 50,000 ships today. IMO member states agreed that for 2030, the carbon intensity of the global fleet had to be reduced by 40% compared to 2008. And for 2050, a 50% total greenhouse gas emission reduction of international shipping. This year, in June, IMO agreed on a further set of binding requirements, which will enter into force in November 2022. And in that way, we will make sure that the strategic objective for 2030, a 40% carbon reduction target, is not just a commitment, but actually is becoming a binding requirement for ships operating worldwide, which will also be enforced globally. IMO member states also agreed that this strategy will be revised by 2023 and thereby setting out a clear pathway to reduce CO2 emissions from shipping.
What are the different technical and operational solutions that could be implemented by ships in the short term in order to minimize their emissions?
Actually, a very wide range of technologies is already existing today and can be applied or can be installed on ships, depending on the size of the ship, also depending on the type of the ship. Think about oil tankers, bulkers, container ships, and also the trading pattern of these ships. And some of the ships, particularly the deep sea trades, so that operate between continents, obviously have a different performance and different options than the coastal trades, which are smaller ships generally, and also ships that make more stops than the deep sea vessels. But for all of these ships, there are various technologies available, different solutions, ranging from better hull maintenance by means of different coatings or changes to the propeller or the bow to the ship in order to improve aerodynamics of the ship and to minimize their energy consumption. But also think about air lubrication, for instance, to reduce the resistance of the ship, as well as speed optimization to reduce waiting times in ports and to allow for what we call just-in-time arrival in the port, so that the ship can immediately go to the berth when it arrives instead of having to wait in front of the port. We also see increasingly ships installing onboard wind power. And in addition to that, there are also, of course, already some alternative fuels such as biofuels, methanol, and other fuels available on the market that will help improve energy efficiency of ships. And I think generally what we see is that IMO's climate regulations really drive innovation of the shipping industry worldwide, and in that way, the uptake of such solutions on board of ships.
Energy efficiency measures alone, though, will not be able to realize the world's ambitions on climate change by 2050. GHG reduction measures will essentially hinge on ships shifting away from high sulfur fuel oil into low carbon fuels. What are those potential innovative solutions, and how can the shipping industry be steered to implement them rapidly?
Like most of the other industrial sectors and transport sectors, it's obvious that shipping will have to move away from from using fossil fuels in order to deliver on our carbon reduction commitments. And today, there are already many promising initiatives and alternative fuels to think about possible alternative fuels such as ammonia, hydrogen, methanol, or biogas, which can deliver on the decarbonization of shipping. However, the big challenge that we are facing today is the substantial price difference between heavy fuel oil, which is relatively cheap and available everywhere around the world, and these low carbon fuel alternatives. And therefore, this price gap, the existing price gap, needs to be bridged. And IMO member states have started negotiations on concrete new measures, regulatory measures, that will address, for instance, the maximum carbon content of these different fuels, but also possible carbon pricing mechanisms. And with new fuels entering into the global shipping fuel market, we need to make sure that their total life cycle greenhouse gas emissions are well taken into account. We hear much about hydrogen, but of course we need to make sure that this hydrogen is not produced by coal in order to be really renewable. Therefore, a market-based measure, which gives a clear incentive and economic incentives together with carbon pricing, could really incentivize the global offtake of the currently more expensive low carbon fuels compared to heavy fuel oils. And IMO has received concrete proposals for such measures by some of our member states, and we will look into these and have negotiations between governments later this year on such concrete measures.
On the 1st of January 2020, the IMO implemented a new global cap, whereas ships will have to use marine fuels with a sulfur content of no more than 0.5% against the previous limit of 3.5%, in an effort, of course, to reduce the amount of sulfur oxide emissions. How has the shipping industry embraced this regulation? Was it by a greater use of low sulfur fuel oils or by the use of scrubbers?
Low sulfur fuel oil really has been the main way to comply with this IMO 2020 requirement. And especially as the fuel price at the early months or the early days of 2020 was relatively low, including because of the outbreak of COVID, low sulfur fuel oil was the main way to comply with IMO 2020. Now that the price spread between heavy fuel oil and low sulfur fuel oil is becoming bigger again, we do see the pickup of scrubbers again on board of some ships. However, due to some local restrictions regarding the use of scrubbers in ports, some ports around the world, the main means of compliance is and remains low sulfur fuel oil. And overall, we can say that the compliance rate worldwide with IMO 2020's low sulfur requirements has been really high, which obviously is really a win for the environment and for human health.
There was a lot of concern before the IMO 2020 implementation that the refining industry will not be flexible enough to meet the extra demand on low sulfur fuel oils. How has the refining industry fared since in this regard?
So actually IMO already took the decision to put in place the IMO 2020 requirement in 2016. So more than 4 years before its entry into force date on the 1st of January 2020. And this period actually allowed quite some time for the global shipping industry, but also for the fuel suppliers, as well as for the refineries to adapt to this new requirement and to adapt fuel production to increase low sulfur fuel production. And actually, we only seen a few supply issues or non-availability issues of low sulfur fuels globally in the early days of the entry into force of this requirement. And Actually, we haven't, or we are not aware anymore of any major supply issues. So we can really see that the refining industry has well prepared and been able to serve the global shipping market. And this experience with IMO 2020 and the regulatory certainty is, of course, also a very valuable experience for the current discussions that we're having around IMO's climate measures.
The EU has extended its emissions trading scheme onto the shipping industry and is set to begin in 2022 next year. How effective will this mechanism be in capping shipping emissions, and would the IMO consider such mechanisms in the future?
Well, let me start by saying that it's fairly difficult, of course, for IMO to comment on an internal EU measure, which is still being negotiated, and it's still a proposal, and the final text will come out in a couple of years' time. However, what's clear is that the EU proposal will only cover a certain percentage of the world trade, namely those ships that go in and out of EU ports. And there's, of course, a large part of the global world trade that doesn't go into European ports. And so those voyages would not be covered by the system. And actually in IMO, we don't want to have such a tiered approach to our environmental measures, which could lead to the oldest and also to the least energy efficient ships to be exported to trade in certain parts of the world, for instance, between developing countries, because other regions, such as the EU, decide to put in place measures that only cover the trade coming into their ports. And the climate problem is global. The shipping industry is global, and IMO's measures are also global. And therefore, we have started concrete discussions on binding requirements that will cover the total world fleet and look into how effectively reduce the CO2 emissions from ships. And we also look into possible market-based measures, such as an emission trading scheme, as has been proposed by the European Commission. But there are other options on the table as well. What's clear, though, is that our measures, IMO measures, will cover all of the global trades to avoid that certain trade routes that are not covered by a regional system like the European one would operate in a regulatory void. And IMO's rules and regulations provide this certainty that the entire world fleet is covered by future CO2 reduction measures.
The IMO only covers international waters and shipping lines. How big of a problem are GHG emissions emanating from national territorial waters, and how could those be addressed?
Yeah, so domestic ship emissions, depending on how these are calculated, could still actually be part of a larger international voyage. For instance, the part of an international voyage between two ports in the same country, but which is still being operated by the same ship that also performs the deep sea international voyage. But looking at the future, and it will be important to have low carbon fuels such as renewable ammonia, hydrogen, methanol, etc., really widespread available in ports around the world to compete with heavy fuel oil. And therefore, particularly to increase in the early stages the demand of these low carbon fuels, and in that way reduce their prices compared to heavy fuel oils, governments today can already promote the uptake of such low carbon fuels for their national ship traffic. And often these national ships, they travel less distance and therefore have a little bit more flexibility in terms of using alternative fuels compared to deep sea traffic. And IMO last November, so November 2020, adopted a resolution calling on IMO member states to put in place so-called national action plans that would also address emissions from domestic shipping. And we have already received some national action plans from some governments, and we have seen in those plans clear targets for reducing emissions from national shipping. And from our end, IMO will also promote other countries to do the same.
Roel Hoenders, the head of air pollution and energy efficiency at the IMO. Thank you very much for taking the time and being on the show.
Thank you very much.